welcome! Hi. So, I was initially planning on doing some testing on Dori, but from what I saw, I got so incredibly disappointed that I just decided I was gonna do that another day. And so I decided to make a video about Kuki. Honestly, the TLDR for Dori is, I don't really like her very much. I don't think any of the things she does are particularly valuable or good. There are a few things that she does better than Kuki, and I don't think any of those things are relevant in the teams where you'd want to play either of them. 55k primos. Yeah, this is my free-to-play account, so I've just managed to get a lot of primo gems saved up.
The same as I remember.
But yeah, so there's a lot of things that actually changed about Kuki with Dendro. And it's not just in one archetype, it's in multiple archetypes. So the reactions that Electro has access to with Dendro are Aggravate and Hyperbloom. The Dendro teams where you use Electro units also include some Burgeon teams. For Burgeon teams that use Electro units, you want your Electro units to be applying Electro to the enemy to help you generate more seeds. If you want to know how, I have a video on it. But if you hit the seeds with Electro, then you're not going to Burgeon, so there's no point of having a Pyro unit. Because you don't want to be hitting the seeds, and because Kuki hits the seeds and doesn't really apply like a really high amount of Electro to the enemies, then there's just no particular benefit to using her over a lot of the other units you could be using in that spot. That being said though, she does have very high value in some of the other teams. There's two teams, or two archetypes, and those archetypes are Aggravate and Hyperbloom. In order to understand like why specifically Kuki's good in Aggravate and Hyperbloom, you have to first understand why she wasn't that great in other teams pre-Dendro. Here's how Kuki's kit works, right? You use your E, consumes a little bit of health, and then pulses around you like this and deals electro damage. Now every second pulse is going to be applying electro, and so has the ability to trigger reactions. At Constellation 0, you get the initial hit, right? This hit doesn't apply electro, then this one does. So that's 2, nope. 3, nope. 4, nope. 5. So that's 5 electro applications from her skill, and then at Constellation 2, you increase by 3 seconds, so you get an additional one, because you get 2 more pulses, so you get another no, and then 6. Her burst, when you're full health, 2, 3, your burst will apply electro 3 times. But when you're under 50% health, the field will last longer, and that means it's also going to deal damage more times, and that means it's also going to apply electro more times. So when you're under full health, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So we reduce the strength of its shield 5 times, so that is 5 electro applications. Now, in order to understand really like how that's relevant, we have to understand how reactions work in this game. Before we had Dendro, we basically had 2 different ways that you could use electro reactions. You had Overload and Superconduct way, which is just apply 2 elements and it does damage. And then you have the Electro Charged way, which is apply 2 elements, and then both elements stay on the enemy and they deal damage over time until one of them is gone. If you want more information, go check out the second video in my elemental reaction guide, which focuses on the non-Dendro reactions and how they work. The main reason why having those 5 electro applications wasn't that valuable is because in order to make sure that all 5 of them overload, it's not enough to just apply Pyro and then Electro. If you just apply Pyro and then apply Electro, you get 1. You should have gotten 2. Did I fuck something up?
What Sir Jeff was trying to show is how the Pyro aura is consumed by triggering overload. This does not work on the Regis Vine's Pyro core.
Let's light it up out of my way!
Your reaction is gonna weaken and or remove the aura from the enemy. And what that means is once the aura is gone, you can't trigger more reactions. There's another way that reactions can work, and that's with Electro Charged reactions. Yeah, as long as you keep reapplying a decent amount of Electro, you'll keep getting your Electro Charges. But the thing about Electro Charged reactions is that you don't get more Electro Charge with faster Electro. Applying 5 instances of Electro really quickly doesn't trigger more Electro Charge. But her E applying it only once every 3 seconds because it pulses once every 1.5 seconds and only applies Electro every 2 pulses means that you won't always have Electro on the enemy. You're actually going to lose it pretty often because it just doesn't apply it very quickly. And so what ends up happening with Kuki in Electro Charge teams is Electro Charge as a reaction can't take advantage of her burst applying it often, and wants faster app than once every 3 seconds with her skill. And then on the other side of it, for Overloaded can't really take advantage of the 5 fast Electro apps from her burst because it's hard to reapply an aura. Overloaded does take advantage of the relatively slow Electro application every time Kuki applies Electro with her E, and you can make it so that if you have Pyro on the enemy, she triggers Overloaded. But like we said, right, you get 5 instances of Electro application at C0, you get 6 at C2. And that's okay, but if you're building her full EM for Overloaded damage, it's hard to justify putting a unit on your team just to trigger 6 reactions per skill. Even harder when it's 5 reactions. Now there is a trick to that though. The way that Electro application works against enemies is the internal cooldown, right? When you apply Electro is enemy specific. If you hit enemy with your first hit and with your second hit won't trigger a reaction. You hit enemy with first hit, you hit enemy with second hit, Overloaded, then there's still Pyro, and the second one does not overload. If you apply Pyro to both enemies, now my Kuki is level 1, so it's very possible I die trying to show this. Right? And you only apply Electro to 1 on the first one. Oh, I think I hit both, didn't I? Oh no, I didn't. Oh well.
Okay.
Right, so I use my Kuki E here, and I trigger Overload on this enemy. But because Overloaded is an AOE reaction, I deal damage to both of them. You can see 30 on him and 30 on him. But I did not hit the other enemy with my E. So if I walk towards the other enemy, and the second hit of my E happens, right here. And it's not going to trigger Overloaded on this enemy, but it will trigger Overloaded on the other enemy. And as you can see, right, the Overloaded AoE is actually going to hit the first enemy again. And so if you manage to have Overloaded happen on 2 different enemies at staggered intervals like this, you can get 1 overload every time your E happens. And once every 1.5 seconds is still slow enough that you can reliably have it be the trigger, but it is fast enough to justify using this unit for damage. Now, the issue with this is you're relying on AoE. It's not just like you're better in AoE, you are reliant on AoE for this mechanic to work with a reaction that knocks enemies away. Which means that while this is definitely an interesting mechanic, it is very niche. It will only work against heavy enemies that don't get staggered and when there's enough of them that you can do it on multiple ones. But it is functional in those teams. If you ended up playing her like this, she was actually pretty okay like before Dendro. You could play her with like fast pyro application from your other units that also happen to be pyro units that have decent damage, and then use Kuki to trigger Overloaded. The biggest issue with that is that very often, if you're playing a fast applicating pyro unit that applies pyro in AoE, it's gonna be Xiangling. And if you're playing Xiangling, you want to be playing Bennett, and if you're playing Bennett, you already have a healer, and so other Electro units other than Kuki could potentially just perform better. Because of those factors, Kuki was a very niche unit. You could also use her for Superconduct, but Superconduct doesn't really deal damage, so you basically just used her in teams that needed Superconduct, which is basically just, it let you play, instead of having Diona as a healer and non-cryo units as your supports, you could do Kuki as your healer and cryo units as your support. The problem with that is that the Electro units were just very good, so you didn't actually really gain much from that. There were still definitely viable Kuki teams with Ella and or other physical carries, I guess. But it really just wasn't anything crazy. With all that in mind, hopefully now we kind of understand why before Dendro, Kuki saw pretty fringe, if any, play. So then, what the f changed with Dendro? Basically 2 things changed. We got Aggravate and Hyperbloom. Let's go through that. So the first thing to understand about Aggravate, when you do Electro plus Dendro, it triggers Quicken. That puts Quicken on the enemy, and when you apply Electro to Quicken, it triggers Aggravate, which deals more damage. The way that Aggravate works, and the way that it works differently from other reactions, is that Aggravate does not remove Quicken. You can trigger it with Electro onto Quicken. It's a reaction between Electro and Quicken, but it doesn't remove Quicken. It just slaps Electro onto it. And so what ends up happening is there's no such thing as Electro application that is too fast. Which means that the fact that her burst applies Electro 5 times over a short duration is actually relevant, because that means you get 5 aggravates. That is very significant. On top of that, without her Constellation 1, the AoE on her burst is not great, but it's fine. But with Constellation 1, she does actually have pretty large AoE. That's something that a lot of the Electro supports lack. You look at Fischl. Most of Fischl's damage is single target. You look at Beidou. It's not single target, but it is reliant on enemies being somewhat close to each other. And also, it's less damage if you're only against one enemy. You look at Yaemiko. She can get a decent AoE on her burst, but most of her damage is tied to her E. With Kuki though, it is true AoE. All of it, actually. Except her C4, I believe. The testing I've done on Kuki was mostly with C2 Kuki, so I'm not actually sure if this has a large range, if it has range at all. But most of her damage, at the very least, is AoE. Kuki's burst has pretty good intervals for Fischl's Ascension 4, a pretty decent amount of times. Right, so Fischl's Ascension 4, whenever you trigger an Electro-related reaction, Oz deals additional damage, and this will always apply Electro, so it will always aggravate. It only works when your on-field character does it, and it has a small, about 0.5 second cooldown on how often it can trigger, but it doesn't have a reaction internal cooldown, so it will always trigger a reaction. And so if you use Kuki and you stay on her after you use her burst, you can get Fischl's Ascension 4 to hit the enemies quite a few times. She's not the only unit that can do it, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. But yeah, so basically, right, Kuki's damage output is generally going to be slightly lower than most of the support options, but she does consolidate healing. And if you would otherwise need to be replacing a different one of your units with a healer, for example, replacing Kazuha or Sucrose, your grouping unit, with Jean or Sayu, you'll generally actually be better off replacing an Electro support for Kuki than replacing an Anemo support for Jean or Sayu. It's kind of it for the Aggravate teams. And the other Dendro reaction that is very relevant for Kuki is Hyperbloom. Now, the reason why Hyperbloom is incredibly relevant for Kuki is because you don't actually need to apply Electro in order to trigger a seed. So I'll show the interaction with Raiden, but it works the same way with Kuki. In the comments, say hi to Gino. I want everyone to say hi to Gino. Say hi or you're cringe. If you don't say hi, I'm gonna find you. Here's what ends up happening, right? As you can see, right? I'm getting Electro hits that don't actually overload every time. Now the reason for that is because Raiden has an internal cooldown on her E, the same way that Kuki does. When it comes to triggering Hyperbloom with seeds that are on the ground, every single hit can proc the seeds. Right, that's the reason you're not seeing any seeds stay on the ground. They basically get procced instantly. Is because basically every single hit of Electro can trigger the seeds. Because like we said when we talked about Overload for Kuki. Nice boomerang. Internal cooldown is a mechanic that is not shared between enemies. It's a mechanic that is individual to each enemy. But that includes the seeds. And when you apply Electro to a seed, it hyperblooms and it disappears. So every time you hit a seed with Electro, it will be the first time you hit it with Electro. Which means that when it comes to triggering seeds, internal cooldown does not matter. It's the same mechanic we use to be able to get one overload on each hit from her E skill when we were against two enemies. Now the reason why that's very relevant is because what that means is basically every 1.5 seconds you'll trigger your seeds. Now the range on her E doesn't look that big, but it is actually deceptively relatively large. Which means that it is actually relatively easy to make sure that every seed you're generating gets hyperbloomed. Kuki's E hits with Electro fast enough to make sure that you won't end up with 5 seeds on the ground at the same time. The reason why that's relevant is because Hyperbloom has a limit on how many times it can do damage at the same time. Alright, so you see we're getting a lot of seeds, triggering 3 at once, but we only get 2 damage numbers. One of them got disappeared before I used my E, but we only got 2 damage numbers, right? Because there is a limit of 2. What that means is if your Electro application is too slow, what's gonna end up happening is you're gonna have multiple seeds on the ground and only 2 of them will deal damage. But with the current Dendro options, once every 1.5 seconds is generally gonna be more than fast enough to apply Electro every time you have 2 seeds. But here's the thing, Hyperbloom, when you build on a full EM build with 4-piece Gilded Dreams, which is generally what you do with your Hyperbloom triggers, when you focus on Hyperbloom damage. You'll get 187 elemental mastery from your main stat on your Goblet, Circlet, and Sense. And if you don't need energy recharge to trigger your Hyperblooms, like in Kuki's case, you can very easily go EM on all 3 pieces. You're not going to need an energy recharge Sense. You're also getting from your Flower and Feather potentially some EM substats, and again, in Kuki's case, she doesn't need any energy recharge, so Elemental Mastery is really the only thing she's aiming for. So you should be able to get about 100 in total from Flower and Feather very easily. It's possible you have less. We can say like 60 total, right? That's 3 rolls of Elemental Mastery shared between 2 different pieces. That's very, very achievable. Your set bonus gives you 80 on the 2-piece set bonus, and if you're playing them solo Electro, gives you up to 150 more from the 4-piece set bonus. If you play her with an Elemental Mastery weapon, like the Iron Sting, you can get another 165. Kuki's C6 can give her more Elemental Mastery, but we'll get to that later.
So Jeff does not get to that later.
So you can very, very easily reach 1000 Elemental Mastery. It won't show up in your stat screen because you need to trigger a reaction in order to proc the 4-piece Gilded Dream effect. This 150 from the 4-piece will not be showing up, and it's gonna say about 850. And because Hyperbloom doesn't get snapshot, when you make the seed transform into Hyperbloom, right, into the projectile, and it deals damage after you gain the Elemental Mastery, which means that even on your first time you trigger Hyperbloom, you get the Elemental Mastery bonus to increase the Hyperbloom damage. Now, the way that the Elemental Mastery formula works for Hyperbloom is 16 times EM divided by 2000 plus EM plus 1. But the damage you're doing with your Hyperblooms before resistances is about 28k. Now, if you end up having your Dendro unit on the 4-piece Deepwood Memory set that reduces enemy resistances, you'll get a resistance multiplier of 1.1. So that's over 30k on each Hyperbloom. Now, the theoretical maximum that she can proc is 11 from her E, that's up to 22, right? Because she can trigger 2 seeds each time. Although right now, we don't have Dendro application that works like that. We don't have Dendro application that generates 22 seeds. In single target at least. And so right now, the highest amount of seeds you can trigger is going to be 6 Dendro applications from Dendro main characters burst, which can be up to 12 seeds, plus 1 or 2 from their skill, which can be either 2 or 4. So basically, right, your like actual hard limit right now on how many seeds you can generate is 16. But even just for 12, this times 12, that's almost 400,000 damage per rotation. 20-second rotations, which is what you'll generally have, that's about 18,000 damage per second. Which is, for a healer, it's incredibly high. Although in Hyperbloom teams specifically, your Dendro unit, with the Dendro units we have right now, likely won't be doing much damage, and you'll be somewhat limited in what your last slot can be, so that it doesn't interfere with your reactions. So she is more of actually just a carry in Hyperbloom teams than she is a support. So, do I think that Kuki is the best option when it comes to Hyperbloom teams? Sadly, no. However, she is most definitely the best healing option. Hyperbloom teams generally will have a Hydro unit. Well, that applies Hydro to generate the seeds, and a Dendro unit. Your Dendro unit can't be a healer because we don't have a Dendro healer right now. Your Hydro unit could be Barbara or Kokomi, although if you want to apply enough Hydro to like make it worth it to play like an actual like Hyperbloom team and not a Quicken team that triggers a few Hyperblooms, you have to basically be on fielding your Kokomi, which is a thing you can do. Otherwise, your Hydro unit is not a healer. And then your last slot, you actually have to be careful because if you end up using another Electro unit, it's possible that that other Electro unit will yoink your seeds. Because you're always generating the same amount of seeds, so you'd rather have all of them be triggered by one unit than have the ownership being shared, so that you can build full EM on one and no EM and just other stats for non-reaction damage on the other. Currently, Hyperbloom teams don't have too many like great options. I talk about some of them in the Singso video, which again, you can check out. Realistically, you do have still some options, but a lot of the Hyperbloom teams I end up gravitating towards very often do not have a healer. Personally, that doesn't bother me that much because, I mean, I play this game for a living, right? Like, I stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/77. I play this game a lot, and that just leads to just learning about the enemy's attack patterns, whether you want to or not when you play the game that much. I mean, you can see it when I'm fighting enemies with cryo teams, because cryo slows enemies down. It slows down their animation speeds by a little bit. And whenever I play an enemy with cryo, I always dodge too early. Anyways, point being, I play this game a lot, so it's pretty easy for me to get away without a healer. But that's not gonna be the case for everyone because some people aren't losers. Some people have other things to do. Some people just aren't that good at video games, and that's fine. Even though personally I don't really care about healing options, that doesn't mean they're not valuable. Now personally, I play teams with Raiden instead of Kuki. I used Raiden to show one of the mechanics earlier. The main upside that she has over Kuki is that it lasts for 25 seconds instead of 15 or 12 without constellations, which means that you don't have to swap back into Raiden as much as you have to swap back into Kuki, which gives you more flexibility in which units you can use and what kind of rotations you can use. Raiden also gives a little bit of burst damage with the passive on her E. I wouldn't use Kuki if I had her on my account, but like that doesn't mean she's not good. That doesn't mean she's not valuable, and she definitely still is valuable. All in all, she used to be pretty now she's actually pretty solid, and that's really cool. It's pretty clear that Kuki was designed with Dendro in mind. I wasn't entirely sure if that was the case when they released her, but they definitely did, right? Like they knew what they wanted to do. Kuki is actually a very coherent and adequate healer for Dendro teams. I'm really happy with her like position in the meta right now. She's not insane, but she's basically what I would expect a good healer to be. Because I'm making this video like kind of as a response to Dori's release, we can just like quickly cover the like main differences between them. And the main differences are basically Dori's uptime is lower, Kuki gets longer duration with constellations, Dori doesn't. Longer cooldown for Dori, and on burst instead of on skills, you need to actually build a lot of ER on her. And if you build a lot of ER, that means you don't get as much EM, so she's not as good in Hyperbloom because of that. She's also not as good in Aggravate because of that. Her lamp hits fast, but only applies Electro 4 times over the whole duration. Yeah, Dori's just not it. But yeah, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and yeah, I'll see you guys around. So if it expires less than 0.5,